ever green, huh? Well, all of the tests are ever yellow and ever red.
Welcome back to Perpetual Jank Machine. I am John.
I'm Miles.
Would you have an introduction?
I was going to make a joke about how I run out of jokes about UI jank for the intro to this, but that was perfect. We're keeping that.
Perpetuating the jank.
So today I wanted to talk about consolidation and uniformity. I'm sure it's no secret that a lot of organizations try to make sure that the technology that they're using is relatively uniform across their various teams and projects. I'm sure this starts to fragment a little bit as your organization becomes large, and it might be a little bit less important for smaller organizations as well, where you kind of know everybody and you know what people are comfortable with. But there is, I feel like, a big push, especially among medium-sized organizations, to get that uniformity down. And I kind of want to talk about some of the pros, the cons, and what exactly you can expect when you are pushing towards uniformity and what you might actually lose when you do that. So been on both sides of this. I was just kind of curious if any of you had any war stories about either problems with people writing things in weird languages or annoyances where you have to write something in C or Java or something like that.
The worst encounter I've had was when I had to go to our backend and find out that they had a mix of Python, Ruby, and whatever scripting language you can have. And so I looked around for a bit. I decided I got scared, came back, and found out that I have to look at C++, look at Objective-C, look at C#, and then a bunch of Windows miscellaneous, COM model communications. And so I decided, yeah, maybe good to be standardized, but I still feel like there's a few too many languages floating around in our tech stack.
I mean, I guess with Python and Ruby, they're kind of in a similar paradigm, so I'm not sure how bad that necessarily is. I'm sure it's not great compared to C++.
It's more of a thing that I got weirded out by the fact that they had so many mix of scripting languages there. Like I was listing two, obviously, but there were a few more there. And I was like, sure, but why? Why was it not uniform? I'm positive that they have some good justification for it, knowing the fact that we come back to the front end of things, and it's like we are faced with a similar situation, and some of our dev tools are written in Electron. And I was like, oh sure, okay, a JavaScript application for devs, sure. I mean, I've never worked with JavaScript before. I do C++ and I do a little bit of Objective-C on the side. I don't know why dev tool is in Electron. So yeah, it's just a weird mixture of things that make me feel like maybe our organization haven't hit the modern stage. We haven't standardized. Maybe we're on the steps of standardizing.
That's actually really interesting, because I figured that you would definitely have, your tech stack would have kind of reached this stage where there is this big document that everybody has to adhere to that's pointed at in some kind of internal dev wiki or something. Whereas the size of our team is definitely not to that scale yet, where we would have a big, wide coding standard that applied to everything. So that's actually kind of surprising.
We have a longer coding standards documentation about whether or not we should indent than we have explaining the actual tech stack of how the code base is divided up, what language you should expect in what areas, and why certain language choices were even made. I feel like one of them is less important about whether or not I should put the % at the end of the line or the beginning of the line. But hey, that documentation is longer. I feel like whoever made those choices want to resolve the fight between petty playground truth and, oh no, put the % at the end, no, put it at the beginning of the line, and didn't actually pay attention to, hey, we should probably document why this app and this tool is made in this way. But I don't know, I'm just being a little grumpy.
The problem is someone's always going to go back on the code and then redo the ampersands. And when the projects get long enough, that takes up more time than actual documentation. So they have to dedicate more time of the documentation. So that way there isn't someone going back and changing it retroactively.
You say it that way, but I feel like that might actually be a legitimate reason, because I've been on many code reviews where I just cite, page 17, line 4, bullet point 3. This says that you should move that parenthesis around because we parenthesized in this order, not the order you did it. And it's like,
wait a minute, okay. You have to manually do that?
What?
You have to like manually specify like your parenthesizations and your line indenting and like formatting stuff?
Yeah.
What? Dude.
So, here's the funny
Why
part.
don't you just use a code formatter? Or something?
Right.
Yeah, like our rule is like we use a formatter, and the correct way is the way that the formatter spits it out.
So,
I mean, not that it always works. Like, occasionally there's like
to have like a code
problems with
editor
it, but
and like a intelligent linter and everything built in, but we can't because on Windows the C++ is compiled with, and you guessed it, drumroll, MSVC, and on Mac that would be all G++, I think, probably GCC. No, I'm pretty sure it's G++.
Is there a good like C formatter that you can dump into your tool chain? Like I know even like Emacs is
Whatever you
somewhat
dump into it,
formatter.
one of them is going to complain about the Mac code, and one of them is complaining about the Windows code because the different compilers are used, and so they are done in different ways.
But the compiler doesn't format your code. There has to be some kind of. I'm
The
really
compiler
surprised that
doesn't
nobody
format
wrote
it.
like something that just adheres
But-
to like your dev documentation of formatting.
There were a lot of hacks about if-def on Windows or if-def on Mac about pertaining to the compiler warnings on a specific platform or making sure that certain platform standards have to be followed. And in the end, it's just, I think like at least 3 devs have tried it in 3 different iterations, and none of them came out happier than before. So, and it's a terrible attempt to make when a dev being granted the freedom to make the code look prettier and not having to be bound by feature and revenue and conversion came out sadder after they finished the code beautification attempt. It makes me a little scared. So.
I remember reading the blog post of a guy who wrote the Go formatter, and he actually came to the same conclusion. I think it was some of the hardest code that he said he ever wrote, just in terms of like complexity. So I can see that, but that also makes me really glad that I don't write C++.
Yeah.
get it? I can see that.
Okay. We are kicking Miles from the chat. I feel like Python and Go, well, especially Go, with just typing Go format, has really taken the correct approach. I mean, I don't like PEP8 because it uses way too much vertical space. Like, who the hell puts 2 new lines behind anything? But I feel like it's the correct approach being standardized on, hey, what this should be, instead of having a homebrew 17-page document about, hey, this is what in-house C++ standards look like. It still makes me annoyed because I've been on both ends of the problem. I've been the one bashing people with, hey, this is what the in-house standard says. And I have been bashed with, hey, you're not doing the code according to in-house standard. I'm like, oh, I forgot. Sorry, page 42 had that. It's really on me. I should have read that much and memorized them all.
It sounds like you're trying to solve your problems with all your personalities with a documentation about formatting standards.
You see, as much as I sound grumpy about it, I'm happier because I don't have to argue. And even if I don't like it, at least I can say, sure, at least it's uniform. So it's not the way I do it, but it's uniform. I cannot imagine how bad it would be when 3 people argue about, no, do it that way. No. Like,
the logical conclusion to this, if we take it to its final form, is that all coding standards should be decided by a coin flip. That way nobody could argue with it. You can't argue that your idea is better because it probably is better, but it was decided by a coin flip. So that's the way we're doing it. You can't argue
that's effectively what you're doing if you use some random dude's linter, because some random dude, if the opinions are evenly distributed throughout the populace, is going to be part of that random sample, right?
Yeah, but then you can at least attack the dude. Like, you know what I'm saying? Like, you can't attack a coin. You're like, I think the U.S. penny is slightly favored for heads. So honestly, we should have used a more fair coin.
I mean, in some sense, that's what standardization is all about, right? Like, if you have 20 choices to make and 50% of each, I'm simplifying, then you're essentially picking 1 out of 20, 2 to the power of 20, which is a million. You're picking 1 in a million path to go down, and that's your standard.
Oh my gosh. Imagine reading that in the documentation. We use 1 curly bracket after our functions because John flipped a coin, came up tails.
Imagine if you did that for your tech stack's choice of programming language. Well, we used random.org, and we listed all the programming languages in the world. And it turns out that we're using VB script to write our app.
Okay, well,
the backend's written in Brainfuck.
Whatever languages you're choosing between, I hope that landing on the side is when you choose PHP.
No, you need to choose all of the programming languages to make it fair. Like Malbolge has got to be in there.
Because otherwise somebody's going to be like, well, you shouldn't have taken C out of the running.
You shouldn't have taken intercal out of the running. What if I liked
okay.
politeness-driven programming?
Yeah. The organization is gonna come back with you with a large bill saying, "Hey, why did you expect $20,000 for a new keyboard for everyone?" And we're like, "Yeah, we picked APL." Oh, okay, sure. Keep going.
You have to write your websites in WebAssembly.
People are doing that. Not
Like
raw
pure
WebAssembly,
assembly?
but well, there's Blazor, which there's Rust, which also, and there's a whole bunch of other compilers to WebAssembly now. As crummy as JavaScript is, I think it gets a bad rap, honestly.
It's never going to go out of favor because enough people attack it that it's just in the forefront of everybody's mind whenever they're.
I mean, you can see that about C. Like, what do you call it? Lingua franca or whatever that is. It's never gonna go out of phase. It's gonna be there for a while.
Maybe. I don't know. It's shrinking. It is shrinking. It's in enough stuff that it's going to be a long time.
It's kind of like, reaching your hand down a rabbit hole. You're going to get mud, worms, or whatever, but in the end, when you reach the deepest, you're going to get out a rabbit. And that's like the sea.
What? Hold on. Hold on.
What?
No. Is that a saying? I've never heard that saying, but it seems like you didn't even think about that and you were just able to talk about it. Like, that's a saying?
That's not.
You came up with that.
Sure. I mean, that's just a notch I thought of.
Like, come on. That felt strangely natural. Like you reach into a rabbit hole and you get a snake and something else, but eventually you're going to get that rabbit. What was it?
Yeah, pretty much like that.
I'm going to go back and I'm going to listen to that and I'm just going to keep repeating that to people. And people will be like, what's that from? And I'll be like, oh,
That drives up our engagement numbers, so go right ahead, Miles. I wholeheartedly encourage it.
Oh, yeah. Where did you get this from? I heard it from a podcast. Hey, one of the hosts sounds like you. No, don't mind it.
Nah.
By the way, I did look up our analytics the other day to see if we did have a German viewer who would have found our previous episode both funny and piteous, and it turns out that we actually don't have enough views where YouTube will show us our audience demographics. Probably with good reason, because if there's one person watching our stuff and they show us YouTube's audience demographics on them, then that's not particularly anonymous, so that's probably for the best.
What, are you going to actually fly to Bangladesh? Yeah, probably not. I don't see the harm.
Shake his hands, congratulate.
Well, I mean, I wouldn't, but, I'm assuming a team of lawyers would probably nix that idea.
Yeah, I could think of several reasons why you wouldn't want to do that.
So to bring us back to standardization on, your tech stack, there is something to be said, obviously, about having replaceable parts in a machine, be that, a physical machine or the machine that cranks out your CRUD software for organization X every year.
Does this mean I'm getting fired?
No, it means they have the ability to fire you. Have they standardized?
That's a whole nother topic, but I think you lose out by not really using the best tool for the job in a lot of cases, where you might have some kind of business case or workflow that would map well to a specific way of thinking about something or a specific amount of strictness that a language might impose upon a certain domain. And you lose a lot of that by using these unprincipled lowest common denominator languages like Java and C++ and C# in a lot of cases. Well,
I mean, in some sense, I agree, but I feel like a lot of cases when a tech stack is, way too diffused, they were used for really domain-specific purposes, because when they're diffused, they're still all general programming languages. They're general purpose. So I feel like the justification is somewhat lost. You can't really, for example, let's just give a very broad example. You can't really switch out SQL. You can hide it behind whatever object relational mapping that you have. But in the end, SQL is down there below, right? So
you can switch out SQL for data log or something like that. There's more than one way to query data.
Right. And now these are very domain-driven things. But above that, you really have few distinctions between languages, and they are really somewhat optimized for certain performances, but they are not strictly prohibitive or non-encouraging of other domains. Like if I want to do Python, the only thing I need to be mindful of is, hey, A, it's not very desktop per se oriented, and B, it's not very suitable for large projects, both because of its dynamic nature and not because of the slow runtime nature. But beyond that, you're able to do it with whatever you want. Similar with Ruby, they're mixing well together.
Mhm.
While I agree that domain-specific stuff should be done in domain-specific language, I don't see the harm in, say, creating those sub-languages in the language of the lowest common denominator you're working in. To give another example, Lispers have a notoriety for doing this. They just write in Lisp, create a sub-language, and then work on that sub-language for a while. Whoever comes to maintain it have to both know Lisp and then figure out what the sub-language is about, and then start maintaining it. But that's still better than 17 different languages in the same tech stack, in my opinion.
I agree, but at the same time, that's kind of something that you would benefit from if you wrote your stack in Lisp and you had a whole bunch of Rockstars that actually were capable of doing that in Lisp, if that makes any sense. But if you're trying to do something like that in C#, I mean, that's just monstrous. You can look at all of the libraries that try to express, for example, logic programming in C#, and none of them are intuitive whatsoever.
Yeah, well, that's fair. I mean, really, if you're working with Lisp, you're already assuming that, hey, I will only be hiring Rockstar from now on because whoever's not a Rockstar is not going to be able to maintain this.
Okay,
So, yeah.
well, even if you're trying to describe, for example, a process that has to be incredibly resilient to failure, like more than your typical application, right? Let's say that you're designing something that's supposed to be running in a car, for example, and it might not be safety critical and that you're not following those 2,000-page manuals that tell you how to write C code that has to be safety critical. But let's say it's like the infotainment system or something, right? You don't want that to crash because your car is not going to get driven off the road, but you're going to have a bad time if your music stops playing on a 5-hour road trip, right? You could write that in Rust and you could have good typing that tells you when something is failing and makes you explicitly handle that and think about all the cases, or it will not compile. Or you could write it in Java, which just throws a null pointer exception whenever it feels like it. And you can just have exceptions coming from literally any point of the stack at any time, sans the check exceptions, obviously. And if you have a Rockstar developer who already is thinking about all of this and is probably working alone, then that's not as much of a problem. But when you're working on a team with different opinions and different levels of, frankly, skill in the domain and skill in the language, it's a lot easier for something like that to slip through the cracks just because Java is a lot less strict about that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Presumably the extra QA time is even going to be worth not switching languages at that point, especially to something C-like. I can see the point in not doing it in like Haskell or Idris or something, but Rust is relatively C-like. You could probably train up a number of Java programmers on Rust in a couple of weeks.
I'm confused. So what's your argument? Why would the fact that you don't want to program that particular system in certain languages support the idea that the language you should use should be less standardized with the corporation you're working with?
So I'm saying that if there is a process that you need to make sure is significantly more formally verified than other parts of your process, or significantly more accepting of change, or more performant, or something like that, and you insist on writing it in Java or C# or C++, and that's your organization's language, then that is not something you should be doing as a responsible product manager, even though that is something that your organization may mandate for homogenization requirements or something like that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I was going to say, nobody wants everything written in one language anyway. And then I realized Node.js. Then I was like, okay, no, that's not true.
Well, that's kind of a thing. You'll see people saying, like, if your team is X size or something like that, or the general rule that I've heard is one programming language per 5,000 employees or something like that.
Well, I think you just don't want more than one language on each part of a project. Each thing a project's involved. Like you're making a car, okay?
Well, let's say that I run an advertising agency, right? And I have a system that bills our clients. I have a system that runs like our dashboard of the hits that you get. And I have a system for, I don't know, permissioning or something like that. Say that you have a premium plan and that gives you extra permissions on the dashboard to use some cool features, right?
Yeah.
I would want to write presumably the payment thing in the strictest language possible just to make sure there's no possible errors like double billing, something like that. And I'd also want to use databases that are not eventually consistent or provide some kind of consistency guarantee. And I'd want to write that with a programming paradigm that is incredibly resistant to failure. So I would want to, instead of, for example, orchestrating things and, if something fails, I need to go take a compensating action, I probably want to just dump it in something and then have like an event bus kind of take that up and, continuously pull and try to do something, and if it doesn't work, just handle that.
What I'm saying is I think it kind of happens a little bit organically, because the more two teams need to communicate, the more likely they're going to be programming in the same language. You know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
So
you might have the people who are handling the payment might be handling like the user signups and permissioning, but that needs to be really flexible because people are adding new permissions all the time, and those permissions can just be arbitrary in scope. So I probably want to write that in. Again, if I were establishing some kind of dictatorship over the technology here, I probably want to write that in some kind of a Lisp.
I don't know. You can get kind of flexible. Like, as he said, it just needs to be close enough for a lot of situations. A team that has nothing to do with any of the other teams, it really doesn't matter what language they decide to write in, as long as it is appropriate for the situation. Whereas,
but then you have the problem where you undergo a corporate restructure in 3 months, and all the managers just move random people to random teams, and then you have no idea what you're doing anymore.
That ruins literally anything. Like, I don't care what your argument is. If you just throw that in there, that the managers could restructure the entire company. Like,
I think the point it's being made is that if you have homogeneous programmers in some sense, when you do a reshuffle or anything like that, the domain-specific knowledge are always obviously gone.
Yeah.
But they don't have to pick up a new language. If you have someone, I don't know, well-versed in C++ for 20 years, they'll probably not make the basic mistakes. Sure, they won't have the domain knowledge, but at least you don't have to hire 12 new employees for a specific app that was written in, I don't know, Rust.
I got you.
And also that cross-pollination in the sense of a totally homogeneous team, if you're working in the exact same tech stack, can also bring some quality improvements, because there might be some good things that are happening in one silo that are not happening in another silo just by virtue of them not communicating. That happened to me before, and within 2 weeks of joining the team, I was able to implement a whole bunch of really basic things that just dramatically improve developer experience and stuff like that.
Yeah, and I'm just feeling like there's that other problem where with every component separation you have, it's not really set in stone and organic. And so when that boundary eventually has to be crossed by some developer working across the two different components, they are by requirement, if the tech stack is not standardized and not homogeneous, having to work with two different mental models at the same time. And the more components the said developer has to work across, the more mental components they have to build up, and the more language he has to be proficient in. And I feel like at some point, when you try to replace that one developer, like for example, after he finishes the project that works across few components and then leave for greener pasture, you're going to have to find someone who either knows those three components well and then train them up on the domain knowledge, or find one unlucky person from one of the components, make them learn the other two languages, and then learn the other two domains. One of them is a lot harder to justify as a manager to the hiring committee or whatever than the other way of doing things. At some point, you have to say, yeah, let's just make it homogeneous. If component X is using language X, let's just do language X so we don't have to justify, say, hey, we're using a new tech stack. Can you hire 7 JavaScript developers? Hey, hold on, why are you hiring JavaScript developers? Because, I don't know, it's better suited for the job. But the rest of the organization is not using JavaScript. How do you plan to replace them? And then the HR department is going to give you a slap on the wrist and say, no, reconsider.
I guess I am a bit too optimistic in terms of how many languages the average software developer does know. But
I would say it's a pretty optimistic view if you are counting in the developers working at larger and more rigid structures. Like your average startup developers, by definition and necessity, have to probably work at least quite a few languages just to get their startup product working off the ground. But the moment that startup takes off or becomes a little successful, you want to have the structure, you want to have a hierarchy. And once that sets in, the structure becomes rigid, and so the things become more replaceable. You don't need one Rockstar developer handling 7 components. You need 70 each, 70 handling one component each. At that point, no, let's rewrite them to be homogeneous. That was in some part the motivation that Facebook did when they just did the whole PHP to C++, transpiler?
Their hack language, you mean?
Well, I haven't worked there myself, so I don't know if it's hacky or not, but
I think that's what it's called.
I mean, it sounds pretty hacky.
Oh wait, was it actually called the hack language?
Yeah, I don't think it's a big thing. I don't even know if Facebook uses it anymore, but that was a thing around 2016, something like that.
I think it was around that time then. But yeah, I just remember reading an article about how someone there worked on the whole huge effort to transpile everything.
I think pretty much any project you want to work on, you definitely want to favor on the side of more homogeneous. You're just adding complexity for like no reason, unless you can find a good justifiable reason to write a certain part in a certain language.
I mean,
which does happen, of course, as you brought up several examples.
Yeah, I'm not really like raging against the idea of making like your bog standard CRUD stuff somewhat homogeneous, but I feel like there are processes that do kind of necessitate it, where if you are just using the discount version of whatever that language actually brings or what that technology stack actually brings to you, then you might at some point be doing more harm than good.
That's why I was like giving the example of startups and whatnot. Like when you're afforded more flexibility, having that flexibility can aid you. And if you take out the big chunk of CRUD developers, your average developer probably knows quite a few languages. But when you count in the CRUD developers and the gears in the machines, like someone I am, then yeah, like there's no reason to have an exposure to other languages, because it's not, the business is not dictating that necessity. Your startup developers need that. They kind of like, you cannot just build a single component and call it a day. And different components in general ask for different requirements and are better suited to different languages, both because of their inherent design and because of the frameworks and community and everything it brings with it. Like, it's kind of hard to say I choose Python over Ruby too because Python is a better language. It's 10 times easier to say I'm choosing Python over Ruby because Python has a huge machine learning library, or I'm choosing Ruby because Ruby on Rails. At some point, the different components are justified to go in different directions, but when you're scaling up, that approach doesn't really work well. And so organization likes to standardize. That doesn't mean it's good by necessity, it just means it's necessary.
I guess that kind of comes back to the idea of the overhead of large organizations as well and disruption, which this is certainly not a business management podcast, but there's not really that great of a solution for that either in terms
Please take this next sentence as financial advice.
So speaking of the wrong tool for the job, y'all saw that post about GTA 5 loading times, right?
Yeah. I don't know what that, not a tool though. That transition doesn't make sense.
Well, they're using the wrong function for JSON parsing.
Yeah, but like, can you really call not knowing the SSScanf hidden below it a wrong tool?
Yes.
Yeah, because they're not using a JSON parsing library. Or if they are, they're using a really bad one.
Okay, if you're an average developer and you can kind of go in and say, oh, well, hey, and your manager walks in and say, hey, yo, we need you to add this JSON for a microtransaction. You're like, okay, just give me a few weeks. I need to look up this new JSON library and how to use it and whatnot. He's gonna say, just, write a few lines of code that scans the line for microtransactions and roll it out. We need the money now.
I think the real screw-ups, they never profiled their code. The guy spent like only a couple seconds and he's like, oh, wow, yeah, there's something wrong here.
I feel like, and I don't want to play the kind of devil's advocate, but I feel like when they added in, the microtransaction shop is not already loaded. It's probably having like 17 items or 20 items. And like, yeah, that's scanned. That goes in half a second. When they add more microtransaction items in, they're like, yeah, sure, the performance got a little worse, but whatever. And over time, people just got used to, yeah, this is the performance what always it has been. Okay,
that makes sense whenever you put it that way. So what you're saying, the problem is microtransaction. No.
You know what? If there's one takeaway from that story, I feel like that's actually the correct takeaway. Or maybe it's way too specific, like knowing a very specific C string function. But that takeaway, microtransaction bad, I think it's very general. I apply it.
Or maybe it's good because it allowed us to find a problem in the code.
I used to catch some flack at my first job about testing on these ridiculously large data sets full of randomly generated data.
But who gives you flack for that? Isn't that like just standard?
Well, no, because they're like, oh, why are you taking so much time to run this big populate database script that fills you up with 5,000 entities and whatnot? And to that I say, having acquired significantly more experience in the field of programming sense, that was actually a really great idea that was well ahead of its time because I have not seen an organization that does that since.
I thought that was something you were supposed to do. Isn't that like stress testing your systems?
Yeah, I don't know.
I just know it's stress.
Yeah, but like,
Oh my gosh.
which one looks better on your yearly review? Having stress tested some components or having rolled out 2 new features? Haha, I already see that.
Recent story. We all test things on just one entity in the database. So we actually didn't realize that if you have like 100 entities in a database, it'll take 30 seconds to load the page.
Okay,
Obviously,
what are you
it's gonna
using some quadratic algorithm? And why?
Oh, you don't even know the half of it, buddy.
Yeah, this sounds like several, like I've heard so many things wrong in just like that sentence.
People say that I'm a little bit strict in my code reviews, and I call that out frequently, but that's because I've seen things, man. I've seen things. I do not let quadratic things pass if they don't have to be quadratic.
Yeah. Scaling up to 30 seconds, whatever was quadratic was pretty quadratic.
Yeah,
Yeah,
like
okay.
100, 1 to 100, and then it goes from like
It's a
a
0.3 seconds per item. That's so bad.
Yeah. Oh my gosh.
I don't know.
That's website bloat right there. That's some website bloat.
Yeah, I can totally see how this happened, and I mean, on one hand, I can kind of see how it happens, and also like performance testing. No organization invests well in performance testing because there was like, oh yeah, we'll set up some performance tests on this virtual machine that is shared with 60 other things. Like, of course, the tests are going to be flaky. It's not going to tell you anything useful.
Okay. Stop right there.
And then as soon as you tell the sysadmins, hey, I need a bare freaking metal box that has these performance guarantees, and then they're like, well, we could give you a virtual machine. And then it's like, no, I want a dedicated core on a system somewhere. Nothing else can run on that core, all right? And then they just totally turn you down. It's
Okay, screw all of our other topics. I like talking about this. Oh my gosh.
well, that's a good idea for another evergreen topic.
Oh my gosh.
Evergreen, huh? Well, all of the tests are ever yellow and ever red, so I don't know. At some point, and I'm not actually kidding about this, at some point, we had an initiative to fix some tests, and it was called Nevergreen. So I really don't know what to say about this traumatic experience.
I feel for the poor little processor cores that had to quadratically parse all of that JSON for all of those years. Like, can you imagine the number of megawatts and man hours that were wasted just
And
because...
it says, didn't it say it was like singularly threaded too? Like,
I mean, JSON parsing is kind of it doesn't have to be single threaded 100% of the time, but it usually should be.
I was gonna say you could just split it up, and I was like, no, then the curly, that wouldn't work.
I mean, you might, if it's like a large file that you know is structured in a certain way, you might be able to extract some parallelism out of multiple cores. However, most JSON payloads are usually not big enough to make that worth it.
I mean, it's a giant list of microtransactions. Like, after you get a couple layers deep, it should just be like stuff that you could split up. Like, you know what I'm saying?
Well, you never know. Okay, if I'm writing a JSON library, right? And this JSON library is going to be used 99.9999999% of the time to serialize something that's under a kilobyte. Like it will with every single like network request that's ever passed through it, right?
Yeah.
Why spin up an extra core? You know what they should have done? They should have made that fixed loading time a microtransaction. Think about that. Priority access, $5 doesn't pin your CPU core anymore.
I was about to laugh until you said the part where it goes priority access. I'm like, oh, that sounds nice. I'm like, oh, wait, hold up.
They fix it, don't tell anyone, and then just Bitcoin mine. So it still takes 6 minutes.
And that's the show. Thanks to Meydän, that's Meyda with an umlaut N, for their track The Beauty of Maths, licensed under the Creative Commons Attribution 4.0 license, which serves as our intro, outro, and interlude music. You can find more in the description of this episode. Please remember that the opinions expressed in this production may not reflect those of other participants on the show, or those of any participants' past, current, or future employers. They're also probably exaggerated a bit for comedy's sake. Anyway, thanks for tuning in.